Okay, what is going on, guys? We're going to dive right into this episode. There is just a ton of information to get to. If you are new to the channel, if you didn't see my last episode, this is episode 2 of a series. Frankly, I thought I would do like 4 episodes for this series, but clearly there's an overwhelming amount of just history that needs to be sort of parsed or pieced through, moved through, however you want to sort of describe it. And so the reconquest of Spain, the discussion of how that happened, the players involved, the religions involved, from the Caliphate in the East, as well as the Pope in Rome. There's just, and obviously all of the native inhabitants of Spain. There's just so many groups and characters involved in all of this that it's just going to take a little more time. So I apologize, but also it's going to be awesome. The Umayyad dynasty of it in itself, that's the topic of discussion for today. And that is, you could write a 10,000 page dissertation on that dynastic group. Obviously, we are going to skim over 99% of that and focus predominantly on the Umayyad dynasty as it ruled within the Caliphate in Al-Andalus or Spain. Originally, they were the ruling class in Damascus, and by the 8th century, they were forced out. Most of them perished. Unfortunately for them, the Abbasid regime took control and defeated them, most of them were killed or exiled. One of them was able to make it out alive, and he moved to Al-Andalus and became the governor there. Again, we're gonna get into the details of that later. And then obviously he had a hereditary line that ruled after him that made up and would eventually give rise to the Caliphate Inn based out of Córdoba. This moment in history generally, but in particular in the history of Spain and Islamic Spain, is seen as the sort of pinnacle. It's seen, Córdoba under the Caliphate is seen as sort of the crown jewel of not just Spain, but of all of Europe. Even Europeans during this time saw it as this imperial city, not so dissimilar from Rome during its height. And historians today argue that not only was it this incredibly wealthy city, modern city in terms of like modern for the time, but it was cosmopolitan. Economically, it was an absolute powerhouse. In terms of scholarly works, they flourished. There was tolerance throughout, up to and including tolerance of Christians and Jewish groups, as well as other ethnic groups. Because again, just to remind you, if you didn't see the last episode, it's not just the Spaniards and a group of Muslims. There's a whole diversity of group within Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, on the Iberian Peninsula at this time. Chris Linné, in his book, A Vanished World, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Medieval Spain, concludes, quote, "A great empire would replace the Romans in Spain, but it would be a Muslim empire rather than the Visigoth dynasty. Muslim conquerors accomplished what Visigoths never could. They lifted Spain from her dark ages, gloom and depression, making her worthy of Isidore's boast, the pride and the ornament of the world, the most illustrious part of the earth." Obviously, like I said, this is a common theme and thread throughout most of the history when you read about Al-Andalus. It is misleading, to say the least, this idea that somehow the Western or Christian world would not be able to rise out of the ashes of the Roman Empire is frankly patently absurd. Or this notion that somehow they only survived literally and culturally thanks to Islam. Again, I don't see the evidence for any of that. I think, if anything, they were a people interrupted by Islamic conquest for hundreds of years. And then obviously by the 15th and 16th century, Islam in the Muslim world had completely weakened and fallen into some sort of decay on sort of the back end, the way that the Roman Empire had fallen off during the 5th and 4th sort of centuries, and then obviously continued to progress and weaken throughout. The same thing kind of happened later on in life for Islam. I find it to be ridiculous. Briefly, in terms of attempting to answer how the sort of European Dark Ages, quote unquote, came about, O'Callaghan notes a Belgian historian named Henry Perrenny, who argued, quote, that the expansion of Islam was the fundamental cause of the decline of the Western European economy, disrupting trade and industry, ruining cities, eliminating the mercantile classes, causing disappearance of money as the ordinary medium of exchange. But O'Callaghan also says, like, yeah, this may have been partially true, but that's not the full picture. And many other historians agree with O'Callaghan, particularly more modern historians. With that said, though, Morera, in his book, The Andalusian Myth, he completely pushes back against this and writes, quote, Christian Europe, including the Christian kingdoms in Spain, could not benefit more from its commerce with the superior civilization of the Christian Greek Roman Empire because, as Henry Perreni pointed out long ago, Islamic warriors' attacks had turned the then Christian Mediterranean Sea into a battlefield and eventually into an Islamic lake, and had consequently short-circuited the direct cultural exchange between Europe and the empire of the Greeks. Therefore, the Islamic Empire was arguably the cause of the relative slowing down of European development in the early, or quote-unquote dark Middle Ages. The scholarly attacks against the Perreni thesis have failed to invalidate its importance to illuminate what happened. Of course, cultural and especially commercial exchange between the West and the East continue to occur, and now largely via the Islamic Empire, but this happened not because of the civilization properties of medieval Islam, but because medieval Islam had interrupted the direct communication in the first place. And again, it's celebrated, really. It's celebrated as this unique moment, not only in history, but in medieval history. But there are problems, and the sort of paradox of the situation, as I'm going to get into today, which is sort of foundational to the thesis that I'm presenting, I suppose you could say, is that, you know, you have all these wonderful things happening in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain, and specifically in Cordoba, and yet the caliphate, the power, sort of imperial power of Islam at that time, does not last very long. You know, if you look at the Roman period, Pax Romana, which is this 200-year period in Roman history where there's a ton of peace, or there's almost exclusively peace, we don't see a Pax Andalusia. And again, the rulership in Cordoba only really lasts approximately 80 years. You could really push it and say over 100 years, but there's so much chaos in the end. I don't know if that's a fair assessment. And really, you have to, the question that is itching away at me, or is haunting me, if you will, as I studied this history, was how could both these two things be true at once? How could it be that the caliphate in Al-Andalus was incredible and modern and tolerant and equitable, and also obviously connected, you know, commercially connected to the rest of the world across the Mediterranean, and also have been so short-lived? And the reality of the situation is everything, or 90% of what we've been told about the caliphate, the Umayyad dynasty in Al-Andalus, it's a twisted narrative. I wouldn't say it was an outright lie. There was a huge omission of facts. And it turns out the Islamic administrative state of the caliphate in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula was remarkably weak due to the fact that it had a complete lack of tolerance. It was constantly sort of on and off, but more often than not, assaulting, treating non-Arab Muslims as second-class citizens, even other Muslims. So Berber Muslims from North Africa were routinely treated as if they were not equals in Al-Andalus. Christians, regardless of if they were dhimmis and they were paying the jizya, the special tax, or if they had converted to Islam, they were both treated terribly. Again, more often than not, historians like to point out the fact that occasionally there were these emirs or caliphs that treated certain specific individuals or groups better, but these are brief moments. They're the exception, not the rule. And it was due to this intolerance that caused so much civil strife, internecine warfare that plagued the caliphate in Cordoba, and ultimately led to its downfall. O'Callaghan describes the Arab aristocracy in this way. He says, quote, all Muslims theoretically were equal before God and the law, but numerous differences among them, racial origin, wealth, and learning, served to establish social classes. The Arabs, though few in number, constituted the military and landed aristocracy, also known as the Kahasa, owning the best lands and filling the chief positions in the administration. Probably no more than 18,000 Arabs entered the peninsula in the first wave of the invasion, and thereafter relatives and dependents of the Umayyads settled in Al-Andalus, but the number of Arabs did not increase appreciably. In the first century of Muslim rule, their ancient tribal rivalries contributed greatly to the disorder of the realm. And essentially what he suggests from there is that, as we'll talk about a little later on, Abd al-Rahman III, who will be the first sort of caliph with the Umayyad Caliph within Al-Andalus, he's able to somewhat, I would say, diminish the struggles and the friction between ethnic rivalries within Cordoba, but also throughout southern Spain and Al-Andalus. Two things can be true at once, as I am fond of saying. There was this sort of pinnacle of Islamic civilization in Cordoba, and the sort of golden era or the glory of Cordoba did indeed exist. This is true. It was commercially incredibly powerful, and there were scholarly works that came from this place, architecture that even to this day, and even in the West, we are inspired by, certainly, that we still go and see when you go and visit Spain or Portugal. But with that said, a lot of these advances came on the backs of heavy taxation that was indeed burdensome and absolute brutal violence in a sort of totalitarian situation in Al-Andalus. Okay, with that said, let's get into it. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. One of the patterns that we're going to see over and over again in this episode is that the Christian population, whether they were the Mos Arabs, so anytime you see or hear the word Mos Arab, it is a Christian that is living in Al-Andalus that, other than their Christianity, they are completely Arabized. So they dress as Arabs, they speak Arabic, they act, right? They've adopted all the cultural practices, with the exception of the fact that they are still Christians. There were indeed Christians that converted to Islam. In my opinion, not really because they believed in Islamic religiosity so much as they did not want to pay the tax burden, because when you're a dhimmi, you pay the jizya, as I mentioned in the last episode that I did. And when you're a Muslim, you were not supposed to pay any sort of special tax. That was indeed meant to be dehumanizing, by the by. So existing in Cordoba and Al-Andalus is this Christian population. Many of them either flee initially or will continue to flee or be exiled or pushed out or choose to leave on their own, depending on who is in charge. As the tax dhimmi population decreases financially, the Islamic State cannot sustain. This is really noteworthy too, and I sort of get into this a lot in the last episode, so I'm just going to gloss over real quick. This is in stark contrast to when the Visigoth nobility came in and took over Hispania or Spanish Rome during the 5th century CE. When they came in, they simply assimilated to the population. They adopted their cultural practices. And again, yes, indeed, they were a version or a sect of Christianity. And obviously the local inhabitants of Spain were Catholic. But with that said, Arianism, which was the religion of the Visigoths, was quite different than Catholicism. Regardless, when the Visigoths move in, unlike the Islamic conquerors, they essentially just quickly assimilated into the native population. Joseph O'Callaghan, a historian on the subject matter, he summarizes the relationship between Islam and Christianity within Spain this way. He says, quote, "The hostility manifested in Spain between Islam and Christianity, based on mutual incomprehension and indeed upon an unwillingness to understand, raised formidable barriers to the assimilation of the victors and the vanquished, and prolonged the military struggle for centuries. Despite religio-cultural differences, Muslims and Christians interacted upon one another, and the Muslims exercised considerable influence upon the Hispanic civilization, yet the links with the Roman and Visigothic past were not obliterated," end quote. One of the, I think, best examples of what he's talking about here is that after decades and generations, there was the Mos Arab population, the Arabized Christian group that existed in southern Spain. They eventually fled, or many of them, if not nearly all of them, fled to the north to join their sort of other native groups that they would have been associated with prior to the Islamic invasion. And when they arrived, they were fundamentally and radically different than their former neighbors. They were, like I said, they were Arabized. They dressed like Arabs. They spoke Arabic. All of their sort of eating habits, et cetera, et cetera. However, they still were interlinked with those in the north, not only because of their religion, but because there was this sort of Visigoth, Hispanic, Roman culture, or the belief that it had continued to exist despite the Islamic invasion. So as I was saying, the native inhabitants, many of them fled to the north. They began to set up a resistance in the Pyrenees Mountains and in a location known as Asturias, the Kingdom of Asturias and Galicia. And all the while, immediately, like as soon as the Muslims arrived, there was warfare, civil war. Very quickly, the Berber there was initially, as I'm going to get into in a minute here, there was a Berber army that sort of raiders that came in, and they quickly diverted their attention away from the Christian inhabitants and towards other invading Islamic armies. And it just illustrates the sort of inborn cultural administrative issues that will plague not just the initial rulership of Al-Andalus, but also the caliphate and the emirs to come in the 8th century. Okay, so I'm repeating myself here, but I talked about this in the last episode, but I want to sort of set this up for you in this episode. There was an individual named Musa. That is a shortened version of his name. His name is super duper long. You can go look it up, but he was the governor of North Africa, and he saw Spain as a potential opening in terms of more Islamic conquests. And so he deployed an individual named Tariq. Tariq was a Berber, recent convert to Islam, and he took a raiding party into Spain and was not only successful, but very, very successful. And originally Musa said, yo, I need you to go, you're just going to go reconnoiter. You know, if you run into some resistance, by all means, fight, whatever, take some booty, take some slaves. That's all well and good. But I need intelligence about whether or not we can even invade this place or what kind of force we need to go. Tariq just sort of Leroy Jenkins the situation. He just fucking goes for it. Okay. And Musa is absolutely furious. And so he deploys with 18,000 Arabs into the Iberian Peninsula to go after Tariq. He eventually catches up with him. And I believe they are able to sort of settle the situation. But by that time, the Caliph in Damascus has brought Musa up on corruption charges in North Africa, and he recalls him back to defend himself in court to Damascus. But by the time Musa arrives in Damascus, the Caliph is dead, and then there was another individual that obviously took over. And regardless, they still prosecute Musa, and he sort of dies without much mention after that. He's prosecuted and it just dies in embarrassment, essentially. Likewise with Tariq, he just sort of fades from the historical record. While all this is happening in Al-Andalus, what will become Al-Andalus, the son of Musa, Abd al-Aziz, he then takes over. He marries, actually, interestingly, this is so Game of Thronesy. I say that over and over again because it's true. Game of Thrones is just I love Game of Thrones, but it's just a massive ripoff of actual historical periods throughout, the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. I think the War of the Roses is another big one. Anyways, Abd al-Aziz, the son of Musa, has now sort of taken over rulership of the Iberian Peninsula, and he marries King Rodrigo's. If you didn't watch the last episode, King Rodrigo was the last Visigothic Hispano-Roman king. He was not only obviously toppled, but killed. And so al-Aziz marries his wife. Supposedly, according to historians, he was seen as an apostate by the Caliph in Damascus, and so he is assassinated. The one thing I just want to say about both Musa and his son Al-Aziz that sort of speaks to the larger conversation that we're having here, there was deep and inherent distrust between what the leadership, the Umayyad leadership in Damascus, and what was going on elsewhere. This empire, this Islamic empire, effectively just was created overnight. I think most people would agree, in so much as like the historical record obviously was more than 100 years, but still is quite fast and dramatic. And so you had the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus that was trying to figure out a way of controlling the empire from so far away, right? They'd never been to the Iberian Peninsula. They knew very little about it. And there was a fear that Musa, certainly and this is Zach's opinion now, I believe there was a fear that Musa, given the reality that he was in charge of North Africa and he had many troops and many resources available to him, that if he was to take over Al-Andalus or Spain, he would be a serious threat to the power of the Umayyad dynasty within Damascus. And so that is why he sent an assassin to kill his son, because that threat still existed in his son. And after that, what ended up happening was the Caliph ended up sending individual agents and representatives to Al-Andalus to govern for him. And it was a complete, utter disaster. Before I move on, I just want to, the last sort of note that I want to make about Al-Aziz, I'm not a expert on Islamic jurisprudence. However, I will say that if someone apostasy, which is essentially an individual going from being a Muslim to a Christian or any other religion, right? You're changing religions, that is seen as a capital offense, and therefore execution is more than appropriate. If indeed Al-Aziz was an apostate, they could have easily arrested him, prosecuted him, and crucified him or beheaded him, which would have been more than normal or justified within Islamic Maliki jurisprudence at this time. And instead, the Caliph doesn't do that. He sends an assassin, which to me seems like he's just trying to take the situation by, take the bull by the horns and just get rid of any sort of political opponents. Okay, enough of that. By the 8th century, the Islamic Caliphate dominated the region and the Mediterranean. So they'd completely taken over at this point. They controlled trade. There was a ton of wealth, particularly in slaves. The slave trade was enormous in the Caliphate and throughout Islamic society in North Africa and Al-Andalus. However, with the death, the assassination of Al-Aziz, like I said, the Caliph sent governors and agents to run and oversee his new, the new area or region of the Caliphate. And like I said, it was a disaster. Many of them were killed. The armies, the Islamic armies that existed there, basically were completely opposed to some sort of agent, foreign Arab agent, overseeing their newly conquered territory. And so these governors just sort of came and went. O'Callaghan notes that few officials and governors in the early days of Al-Andalus remained in office for very long, and points out the weaknesses of Islamic administrative functions at this time. And he says, quote, "Few remained in office for long. One served for 5 years, others for as little as 6 months. This rapid turnover contributed to the weakness of the administration and the active participation of the governors in tribal rivalries was not conducive to a stable and orderly government." I have to mention this, but I don't want to get too, it's fascinating just on a level of anthropology, if you will. I'm hoping I'm using that word right. Islamic civilization, especially in this period, you have to remember that the aristocracy that had gotten to the top, they were predominantly, if not exclusively, Arabs. I wouldn't say exclusively, but the vast majority were indeed Arabs. And these groups were tribal because originally they were Bedouin tribes. They came from the desert. They relied heavily on the sort of familial continuity amongst their group. And that cultural, that paradigm that existed within the Bedouin tribes was brought into this sort of imperial, massive empire that they had created. And so tribal and ethnic rivalries would just continue to plague not only the entire caliphate, but also the sort of governing body of Al-Andalus. And this is indeed Islam's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. As it conquered across the Levant, into North Africa, and into Europe, they could very quickly destroy an army and say, hey, you can either, your option A is you can convert to Islam and you can join our forces. And oh, by the way, you will reap all of the benefits of conquest up to and including booty and material, obviously material goods, jewels, gold, and then whatever other resources, horses, literally resources and horses and slaves, right? You can either keep them or you can sell them. And so you can go from being this tribal individual that is living in absolute poverty, or you can go own land in this new conquered region and sell and buy and trade slaves. But also, like I said, there was a lot of distrust among the different ethnic groups, and particularly the Arabs wanted to dominate all of the caliphate and all of the Islamic world. And they did not trust Berbers. They did not trust the recent converts in the Iberian Peninsula, and also in Syria and Iraq, what would become Iraq. And so all of these things create civil unrest and civil war. I talked about this in the last episode. The Berber forces from North Africa are indeed Muslims at this point, and they made up a large portion of the army that existed, the initial invading army and the occupying army in Al-Andalus. And they absolutely, many of them, if not nearly all, well, you can never say all, but many of them just not only distrusted the Arab aristocracy that ruled over them, but they also absolutely resented them. And this is also true, of course, of the Christian the Christian Spaniards, that existed under Islam. They were all treated as lower tier or second class citizens, despite what historians and scholars and intellectuals say today. Again, I mentioned this in the introduction, but when they were treated justly or well, that was the exception. That was certainly not the rule. Dario Fernandez Morera sort of highlights this point in his book, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, and he notes, quote, in Al-Andalus, Muslims referred to the converts to Islam as Musalima or Asalima, and to the descendants of these converts as Muwalladun, a word derived from the language of cattle breeders, meaning crossbreed or mixed ones. In other words, a descendant of a convert was seen as a crossbreed, mixed one, or different from quote unquote pure Arabic Muslim. Arab leaders certainly were a minority in Al-Andalus, and they feared other tribal groups, including recent Christian converts, or I should say Muslim converts from Christianity. There was a fear that they would take them over and become the ruling class, and they would not only lose power, but they would lose all of their wealth. And so you have this sort of oligarchy, this Arab oligarchy that exists in Spain and just begins or will continue to crystallize their power during the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate in the Iberian Peninsula. And by the way, this is all despite Quranic teachings. And in Quranic teachings, if you ask a Muslim today, you know, a Muslim is a Muslim is a Muslim, meaning like it doesn't matter. It's supposed to not matter what ethnicity you are, where you come from, where your family comes from. But of course, during this time and even to this day, many Muslims and followers of Islam just do not believe that. And those tribal familial ties, those regional ties, are still very, very prominent. And of course, the fears of the Arab aristocracy were not baseless. The Berbers were notorious in Al-Andalus in terms of just their revolting against their leadership. Moreover, Damascus, that is, sent a Syrian army to quell the rebellious Berbers that were there. They were successful. And then when they were recalled back to Syria, the newly arrived army refused to come, and in fact ended up capturing and crucifying the emir in Al-Andalus. So you can see all this sort of, like I said, internecine warfare, civil war between these various ethnic groups. Finally, this sort of turmoil came to an end in 756 when the Umayyad Dynasty reestablished itself. Instead of being in Damascus, now it was in Al-Andalus. With that said, though, obviously they had been knocked off of the throne, so to speak, in Damascus. And it took a little while before they were able to, like I said, reestablish themselves in a leadership position. And they were able to basically quell all of this sort of ethnic rivalries at this time in the Iberian Peninsula and end the sort of tribal governmentship that had existed there prior to their arrival. So while all of this was happening, like I had mentioned in the last episode that I did, you had the Christians. There were already Christians existing in the north in the region, Asturias and Galatia. And then obviously you had many refugees that were exiting the south and moving north. There was a king named King Peleo who claimed to have been at least according to the sources, he was the grand nephew of King Rodrigo, the last Visigoth king that had existed there. And essentially they had set up themselves in a mountainous region. And that's noteworthy specifically because obviously if you know anything about military history or conquering armies, they usually get hung up when they enter into mountainous regions, see Afghanistan and any army, whether it was Alexander the Great or the Russians or even the Americans, who faced serious troubles in thwarting their enemies in the mountains. And so the Christians knew that, and they sort of set up a guerrilla base there, if you will. Eventually, the Islamic powers made their way to the north in order to at least try to stamp out the remaining Christians there. And with the Muslim armies was a bishop. His name was Bishop Opa of Seville, and he was a member or associated with the Watitsa family, which again, for those of you who didn't see the last episode, this family was in opposition to King Rodrigo and had recruited or attempted to recruit the Islamic armies in North Africa to assist him in delivering a coup d'etat against King Rodrigo. Although it's fair to say that I don't think that this individual, his name from the family was Count Julian, he did not at all expect these Islamic armies would take over. However, that is what happened in the aftermath. Members of that family were treated generously, I should say, by the new Islamic powers. And so this bishop was among them, and he spoke with King Pelayo before this battle and just said, you should stand down. You can be friends. We are friends with these new Muslim rulers. And of course, King Pelayo basically said, eat shit and die. and obviously way more elegant than that. But according to the Chronicle of Alfonso III, written in the early 10th century CE, the bishop said, quote, I know, brother, that it is no secret to you that not long ago all Spain was under the sole rule of the Goths, and the army of all Spain was gathered together, but could not resist the impetus of the Ishmaelites, which is one of the ways they would reference or talk about Muslims. How much less able are you to defend yourself on top of this mountain? But hear my advice and turn your mind from this purpose so you can enjoy many good things in peace with the Arabs. And then King Pelayo apparently responded and said, quote, I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their rule. For we trust in the Lord's mercy that on this little hill that you see the well-being of Spain and the army of the Gothic people will be restored. On May 28th, 722, they resisted. They fought this pitched battle, apparently, and the Christians won. And this is sort of seen, I think, as the moment where the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula started. At least some historians would argue that. I think it's fair to say that it is justifiable in the argument that this was the moment of a clear sort of signal of their resistance, saying, no more, you will not go any further. You will not destroy us. Among Muslims, I should say, this was seen as just like a mere skirmish that wasn't not really a big deal. According to Christian chroniclers, however, this was the moment. And contemporaries report, quote, liberty was restored to the Christian people, and by divine providence, the kingdom of the Asturians was brought forth. Like I said, the Muslims thought this was just like a minor skirmish and it was no big deal. And according to Ibn Hayyan, an Islamic contemporary, he said, quote, what are 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They must inevitably die. Like so many conquering armies throughout history, they seem to ignore mountain tribal peoples. And in the future, it remarkably, it always comes back to bite them. And this is certainly true in the case of Al-Andalus. Pelayo's son-in-law, his name was Alfonso I. He takes the throne and is fairly successful at expanding the Christian borders down to what is known as the Douro Valley. And this is, look at the map, you can sort of see it here where it's at. This, for the time being, and for multiple generations to come, will sort of be the line of demarcation, the frontier zone where so much of the fighting between Christians and Christian armies and the Muslims in the South will sort of meet and clash with one another. This is a frontier war. It is certainly more akin to the Texas Rangers. By the way, the Texas Rangers were, historically speaking, interconnected with the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, without any doubt in my mind. And so this is sort of a frontier war that goes on. It is radically different from medieval warfare that you may think of when you think of this period, the type of warfare that goes on, particularly in Europe amongst other European, obviously Spain is in Europe, but I just mean like with the Franks and the Germanic people. And then you have obviously the Italian peninsula. And so how those armies would go to war with one another is I would say not radically different, but very different than the way in which the Spanish frontier knights went to war against the Islamic powers in the south, all of which we are going to get into in the next episode. But I do want to just sort of touch on that. Meanwhile, the Umayyad dynasty was beginning to fall apart in the east. And in fact, the Abbasid, which is that rival dynasty, the rival Islamic family, topples the Umayyad regime. It is a hostile takeover. It is violent, to say the least. There are some of the Umayyad family that are able to escape. Eventually, what ends up happening are the Abbasids essentially approach them and say, hey, we want to sort of bury the hatchet. You know, no hard feelings. Yes, we toppled your regime, but you know, let's just have bygones be bygones, and everything is okay. So they invite them to this banquet, this feast between the Abbasids and the Umayyads. And this is I don't know how many times this happened in history. I've heard of other moments of this happening, and I can't remember specifically where. But this is the George R.R. Martin Red Wedding. I think it's called the Red Wedding. Bloodbath. Basically, the Abbasids invite them, and during this banquet, they surround the table with their guards, with their soldiers, and just absolutely murder all the Umayyads that are there. And supposedly they just continue to eat, I believe is what I read. And it was sort of seen as like entertainment, the execution, the mass execution of their rivals. One of the Umayyad family members' descendants was able to escape. His name was Abd al-Rahman the first, because there's going to be a few of these guys. He was the grandson of the Umayyad, the last Umayyad Caliph, and he fled to North Africa. He was very distrustful, obviously for obvious reasons, of other Arab Muslims, and so he raises an army of Berbers, North African Berbers. You know, again, we see these obviously very, very willing and ready tribal, new convert tribal group. So he hires them. He also has a slave army. This is a pattern we're going to see repeatedly throughout the Al-Andalusian Caliphate, and that is that leaders are fearful of potential rivals within the Arab group, if you will. And so what they end up doing is, instead of having an Arab-based army, they typically, not typically, but they very, very often would go out and hire mercenary armies that were ironically made up. Many of them were made up of Christians from the north, as well as North Africans. And so you have these Arab Umayyad leaders that surround themselves with non-Arabs because, again, they just don't trust anybody. Abd al-Rahman eventually arrives in Al-Andalus. And again, he goes to war with those there, not only to maintain power, but to really to establish his power. And this would be, he doesn't set up the caliphate or the caliphate in the West. However, his sons, the generations to come, will indeed do so. But he is sort of the starting point. There's a bunch of civil war, internecine war within the Iberian Peninsula. He arrives, he quells all of this rebellion and is able to organize the Islamic State there in the mid 8th century. He calls himself, or becomes, the emir of Al-Andalus and sets up his headquarters in Córdoba. And he, along with his sort of capacity to quell all of the rebellious groups, he also sets up what will become one of the most incredible, rich, culturally wealthy cities throughout the entire medieval world. And during his reign, he begins the construction of the Cordoban Mosque on top of the Christian Basilica of St. Vincent. Although to this day, the Mosque of Cordoba, it's been turned back into, or was turned back into, a church. And even though it is a church and it originally started as a Christian establishment or church or whatever you want to call it, it is still to this day considered sort of an Islamic architectural masterpiece. This is despite the fact, by the way, and historians routinely just completely ignore this point, that nearly all of the architectural details and designs are deeply rooted and based off of Hispanic, Roman, and generally Roman as well as Greek architecture. Moreira notes in his book, quote, "The Islamic conquerors used the Church of St. Vincent's main facade for the facade of their mosque. They also cannibalized columns and other building materials from the Hispano-Roman and Visigoth churches. They adopted a Roman technique in altering red brick and white stone in the arches. That alternating pattern is still visible today in some Roman aqueducts of Spain. The mosque's horseshoe arches imitated Greek Roman arches and Visigoth arches. Finally, the mosque's mosaics were of Greek manufacture. Just to sort of really push this point or crystallize or solidify this point, whatever you want to call it. When I was in school and I was learning about the Mosque of Cordoba, everybody failed to mention that the horseshoe arches that exist to this day were originally of Visigoth and Roman form. They weren't created by any stretch of the imagination during the Islamic rule within the Iberian Peninsula. However, it is somehow never pointed out. And again, they just celebrate it as this sort of Islamic invention, even though it is not at all. It would be a lot like studying Roman architecture and not mentioning the fact that all of it is deeply, deeply rooted and influenced by ancient Greek architecture. So after the emir died, Abdul al-Rahman, his son Hisham, took the throne and continued to wage war against the Christians and was eventually checked by Alfonso II in 795. And then we have the great grandson of Abdul al-Rahman named Al-Hakam I, and he took the throne of Cordoba after Hisham's death. And his entire reign was just met with complete upheaval and civil strife. For one reason or another, he apparently did not get along very well with the Islamic religious leadership. And again, for those of you who missed the last episode or just didn't watch it, the Islamic jurisprudence, that the lawfare that existed within Al-Andalus throughout not only the Caliphate, but the history of Islamic Spain, was called Maliki jurisprudence or Maliki teachings. And so you had the Maliki religious leadership that just did not get along with Al-Hakam I. And so they apparently suggested or accused him rather of being a drunkard, not following any of the sort of Islamic religious teachings, and he was supposedly a tyrant. All of these things were certainly true. I mean, so he's the grandson of obviously Abdul al-Rahman I. And I can't, statistically speaking, at least in the West today, my understanding is that many individuals who start companies and create, all kinds of wealth and stability and, millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, by the time their grandchildren take over the business, they effectively spend all the money. They are greedy. They've never known a world. They were born on third base and claim to have gotten a home run. And so he ignores many religious laws. Eventually, there is a plot against his life. He discovers the plot and thwarts the plot and crucifies 72 of the leaders of that group. Obviously, these are all Muslims at the time. They are not necessarily Christians. In order to sort of shield himself from all of this sort of discourse, he hires a mercenary army, again, made up of non-Muslims, or at least the Muslims that are there are the Berbers, but then he also hires a group of Christians, I believe as well, Franks and Galatians, who are under the command of a Christian named Count Rabbi, spelled R-A-B-I. And he insulates himself in order to protect, obviously, himself and his core and his dynasty, his rulership, from all these religious leaders. But in order to pay for this army, he obviously has to continue to tax people into oblivion. And again, like I had sort of mentioned in the beginning and during the introduction, this is a pattern that plagues the emirs and eventually the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty. And so what does he do? He goes to the demis. He goes to many of the recent converts from Christianity to Islam and just doubles down and ratchets up the pressure in order to pay for his armies, which causes even more civil discourse, as well as people leaving in droves to the north. And again, it's kind of like a self-eating snake. And this is the way in which, unfortunately for Islam, this is how they govern. It is deeply entrenched and tied into their religiosity. And the sort of fiscal structure foundationally is taxing non-Muslims, so the Jews and the Christians. But that is never enough, particularly in Al-Andalus. And so what they're forced to do when this happens is they have to start taxing other Muslims even more. So the Berbers, and then the Berbers revolt, or new Christian converts, and they revolt. And so increasingly, it just creates an inhospitable life within Cordoba and throughout all throughout all of Al-Andalus. O'Callaghan notes, quote, the citizenry, especially the Muwalladun, who are recent native-born Christian converts, crushed by the burden of taxes and bullied by the royal bodyguard, rose in revolt in the southern sector of the city, meaning Cordoba. In 818, Al-Hakam put down the uprising with great barbarity. 300 notables were crucified, and the inhabitants were expelled from the district, which was razed to the ground. So again, just to reemphasize the point that when the caliph or when the caliphate in the West was tolerant, that was an exception, not the rule. The rule typically was treating all of those non-Arab Muslims very, very poorly. Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this as well. While all of this is happening in the south and the north, Alfonso II takes the throne of Asturias, and he really begins to leverage the continuity, or the claimed continuity, I should say, between his rulership and the Visigothic leaders that preceded him, which belies the idea that the original native inhabitants wanted or desperately were seeking out assistance from the Islamic world to overthrow the Visigothic rulers. In the aftermath of the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, again, when the Reconquest started, almost every leader from the beginning to end claimed to have some sort of connection or relationship with the former Visigothic nobility. So this is happening. Also, apparently, the tomb of the Apostle of St. James the Great was discovered in northern Spain. And this is a critical moment. This will become a site of European and Christian pilgrimage. So it will create all kinds of lines of communication between Spain and the other larger Christian world, and particularly with the Pope. And this will just sort of build momentum, and the tomb would lead to an expansion of sort of Christian militaristic and cultural opportunities within the Iberian Peninsula. Ibn Hayyan, an 11th century Muslim chronicler, noted, quote, Santiago is one of the sanctuaries most frequented not only by the Christians of Andalus, but by the inhabitants of the neighboring continent, who regard its church with veneration equal to that which the Muslims entertain for the Kaaba in Mecca, pretending that the tomb is that of James of the 12 apostles. They say that he was bishop of Jerusalem and that he wandered about the earth preaching until he came to that remote corner of Andalus, that after the death of James, his disciples carried his body and buried it in that church. Now, is any of this true? Probably not. Did the Christians believe that this was the case? Maybe, but I think there's certainly the possibility that the rulership in Andalusia and Galicia needed some sort of motivating religious factor, not only for their own people, but for other Europeans. And again, creating that bridge and that connection that would allow them to facilitate the Reconquest. This was certainly the thing that would inculcate all of these ideas. The next sort of major figure in Cordoba was Abdul al-Rahman. Oh my God, I can never say this. Abdul al-Rahman II, and he came to power in 822 CE. And there was still all kinds of warfare taking place in the north and in the south. But during his leadership, during his reign, he was really able to push forward or promulgate scholarship, poetry, music, and as well as administrative institutions and functions that, again, would just lead to this idea or this concept that Cordoba was the sort of crown jewel of the medieval world, and obviously within the caliphate itself. One of the chief sort of successes he had during his reign was the conquest of the Balearic Islands, which is to the east of the Iberian Peninsula. And these islands were critical to maintaining a naval presence throughout the Mediterranean, which of course would create more trade, more continuity between the West and the East, or vice versa, between Damascus and Cordoba, as well as North Africa. And what it also did was it basically encased medieval Europe and the Christian world in this sort of glass. And so that when they lost the capacity to move across the Mediterranean freely, obviously this was the first time, it was sort of the Islamic world was continuing to ratchet up the pressure against them. This is what pushed them, I would say, into a world that just did not have the same modes or means, forget about communication, but just the wealth, the trade, the sort of not capitalism, but the capacity to move goods and services across the ocean or share concepts or ideas faded away, which certainly brings about some of the most powerful empires in the world, right? You get certain ideas, for example, Arabic writings were directly from India. So they adopted the Indian way of, numbers. The number system comes from India and was adopted by the Arabs and the Muslims, right? Everyone says Arabic, what is it? Arabic numbers, when in actuality, historically speaking, they're Indian numbers. They were just adopted by the Muslims. So anyways, when you lose that connection, power begins to fade. And that is certainly what is going on in the mid 9th century. Much like his predecessors and those who will come in the future, he just continues to ratchet up the pressure on the dhimmis. He allows or facilitates the destruction of churches, either due to just Christian hatred, or they want to use all of the materials to build new mosques. He looks the other way, and Christian priests are stoned in the streets. As a result, they publicly denounce Islam and their prophet and begin what was known as the Martyrs movement in 850. Again, this is one of those things where you could have a whole episode dedicated to the Martyrs movement in the Iberian Peninsula. Just know basically Christians were coming out and publicly condemning not only their Islamic leadership, but also the prophet and their religion. And the Muslims were more than willing to crucify and kill them and execute them. By 852 CE, Muhammad I takes over the position of emir in Al-Andalus. While the Martyrs movement is taking place, obviously there's all sorts of civil decay and frustration and revolting violence. And much like Al-Hakam, his predecessor, he too treats the Muwalladun very poorly, and obviously the Christian dhimmis as well. And one of the things that historians point out is that he does not allow them, despite the fact that they are indeed Muslims, he will not allow them to operate or work within the administration, and just generally speaking, treats them like an underclass or second class citizens. And this is a crucial moment within the history, in my opinion. And I don't know if every historian agrees with me on this, because this is one of the first moments where you have you have Muslims who are willing to reach out to Christians in the north and work with them and basically team up against Cordoba. O'Callaghan notes that this was when Muslims, like I said, joined forces with the Christians in the north, particularly along the frontier areas. Like I said, that zone, the line of demarcation. Ordonio I, who is now the king of Asturias, reaches out to the Muwalladun, and they, like I said, begin to work together against Muhammad I. And despite the fact that the emir is deploying armies in the frontier to fight the Christians and his Muwalladun, he is largely unsuccessful. Meanwhile, sort of after this or during the same era, Ordonio passes and his son Alfonso III, or who's also known or referenced as Alfonso the Great, takes over. And he is really able to push the envelope in terms of continuing the reconquest, or he's one of the original figures that pushed the frontier zones even further. And one of the big successes that he had is he was one of the first, if not the first, who started the colonization program that was taking place in the wake of frontier warfare, Christians against the Islamic powers in the South. Essentially, in the military, we call it white space. And it's when you've created an area, if you locked in an area with a sense of security to the point where the enemy no longer has, or it's been significantly reduced that your enemy has any sort of involvement or can really do anything within a zone or an area of operation or an AO. And so Alfonso III is able to push and create more white space in that frontier zone, and he begins to colonize the area. What does that mean? He creates all kinds of incentive structures to move families, obviously Christian families, from the north, or maybe the Muwalladun or other dhimmis that are existing in the south and then want to get out of Al-Andalus and start to live and work with the Christians in the north. And they begin to build settlements in town and municipalities. And obviously at first they are humble, and then over time, over the hundreds of years that they progress, they obviously turn into major cities that still exist to this day. And this is true in terms of the reconquest. The colonization of the territory, the frontier zone, is absolutely critical to the overall strategy of retaking the Iberian Peninsula. O'Callaghan describes his progress this way. He says, quote, Continuing the colonization of the Douro Valley, Alfonso III repopulated Zamora, Toro, Simancas, and other places. Many Mozarabs fleeing from Al-Andalus settled in these new towns and elsewhere in the kingdom of Asturias, and by their presence helped to make known and to reinvigorate the Visigothic tradition. Alfonso III also raided Al-Andalus at will. Nothing better illustrates the debility of the Umayyad regime than Asturian devastation of the neighborhood of Seville in 901. So part of Alfonso III's success certainly was the fact that the emir in the south was just super ineffective. They were losing control of Al-Andalus. They were becoming so wealthy that they lost sight of what they were supposed to do and how to govern. And that obviously gave a huge opening to the Spaniards and to Alfonso III, clearly. Not so dissimilar from his forefathers, another key sort of concept or idea is that Alfonso III reiterates that he is indeed a part of this sort of Visigothic nobility line that existed hundreds of years prior to him being born and taking control of the kingdom. But again, this just sort of legitimizes his position within his rulership and also the history of his people. And he actually takes it one step further. And this is absolutely crucial. This is something that historians, in my opinion, sort of gloss over. They don't talk about it a lot, but it is sort of the moment where the Christians have if they were a business or a company, this is their mission statement that will outlive different rulers as they progress through the history of the Reconquest. And so it doesn't matter at what period or what moment, this idea has been incepted in their mind, like Leonardo DiCaprio jumped in and did his little thing in that movie Inception. What Alfonso III does is he claims to be the imperator of all of the Iberian Peninsula, of all of Spain, or what was Spain, which simply means he is the king of kings. Even though most of the region has been taken over by Islam, he still claims to be the king of all of it. And obviously, literally, that's not the case. But those are the dreams and aspirations of the Hispanic, Visigothic, Roman people. And this idea will endure after him. It will be adopted by other leaders within the Christian North. And to me, this is like I said, this is just the company mission statement. So no matter who is in charge, who is alive, it's sort of like on the back wall of like, hey, this is what we're here to do. We haven't accomplished it yet. We're going to keep going. The way it is described by the contemporaries is this. It says, quote, Alfonso III proclaimed the responsibility of the kings of Leon to recover their heritage, to reconquer the ancient territory of Hispania, and to expel the Muslims from the peninsula. Now, of course, like so much of this history, you'll have the Christians who are super successful. And on the other side, the Muslim people, Islam, the Caliphate is significantly weakened for any number of reasons, external threats, internal threats. And there's always this sort of seesaw pattern, if you will, throughout the history. Alfonso III, tragically, despite all of his success, is pushed aside by his three sons who demand that he step down so they can take over the rulership of the people of the north in Asturias and Galicia and Leon. For whatever reason, Alfonso III does this, and he ends up passing and dying. When he splits the realm up between his sons, it obviously creates schisms and fractures that the Islamic world can certainly take advantage of. And right around the same time, we have Abd al-Rahman III. Told you there was a few of these guys. He now takes the position of emir in Córdoba. And unlike his predecessors, he is a far more effective leader. One sort of cool side note I want to mention about Abd al-Rahman III is, like so many of the Islamic rulers, whether it's like actually the caliph or emirs, governors, military leaders, whomever, many of them were born from concubines. Unlike the sort of European royalty, they do not have to be born like what we would call a bastard child in the West, I guess. They are still legitimized as the sons of the previous ruler. So like Jon Snow, for example, if he was a Muslim, there would be no problems, given the fact that he was the bastard, well, supposedly the bastard of Ned Stark. And so it's super fascinating because so many of the women in that are concubines of the Islamic rulership are indeed Europeans. Abd al-Rahman III had blonde hair and blue eyes and presumably was Caucasian. And he was actually very short, which apparently, if I remember correctly, he didn't really care that he was short. I think he even had to have a special saddle, but maybe I'm making that up. Anyways, he actually dyed his hair darker to look more Arab, which of course I think is super fascinating. But he wasn't the only one. It was super common. This happened a lot, a lot. Unlike his predecessors and many leaders, just generally speaking, throughout the medieval period, Abd al-Rahman III was super effective on the battlefield, number one. And number two, he was able to bring all these different ethnic groups together and have them work in harmony with one another in a way that typically Islamic leaders could not do in the past, right? His predecessors had a lot of issues bringing any sort of stability to Cordoba. Abd al-Rahman III, however, that is one of his sort of chief goals, and he does indeed succeed. In terms of, there were all these rebellions from other sort of Islamic factions, specifically families, that were going on in other cities all throughout Al-Andalus. One of his goals right off the bat was to quell these rebellions and take out these rebel leaders. He is very successful. One of the reasons why he's so successful at this is because I don't know where it came from. I couldn't quite find the answer, but he's really good at siege warfare, which is typically where you end up in the later stages of military campaigns within Spain and throughout the medieval period also. The sort of strategy he would use is he was really good at setting up logistical supply lines. So he'd deploy an army, and then from Cordoba or wherever, he could set up supply chains to his army, feed his army, make sure they were well taken care of, so they could basically blockade their enemy or the rebel city and ensure that no food is getting in, that they are constantly being hammered by military forces. And you just sort of wait it out. And that is one of the chief ways in which you defeat your enemies during siege warfare is they get sick, they die, and after months, if not years, they will eventually just surrender. And Abd al-Rahman III recognized that he could just wait out his enemies so long as he maintained those logistical supply lines to the guys on the outside of the wall that are waiting for the enemies to just give up within. So he does that. He also expands his navy with 200 ships, I believe. And what this does is it just provides him more commerce, more opportunity, more trade, more communication throughout the Mediterranean world, which obviously, much like the Roman Empire, this leads to a ton of wealth and obviously commerce, and just a bolstering of the economy, not only within Cordoba, but all of Al-Andalus, coupled with this sort of economic opportunity, if you will. He also loosens, I should say, is the sort of the way I think I should describe it, the sort of harsh treatment of the non-Arab Muslims within Cordoba. So he allows the Muwalladun, the Mozarabs, Jews, Berber Muslims. He's beginning to allow all these people to interact and work within his government administration, but also just more economic opportunities within Cordoba. So it's not such a stressful thing. He's not creating a free market by any stretch of the imagination, but he's certainly creating more competition now because there is not this religious tribal barrier. Right? You don't have to specifically be an Arab Muslim to do X, Y, and Z. Now you've got 10 different people who are all competing with one another commercially that are allowed to be a part of whatever this commercial trade over in the bazaar. And then also he's allowing them to work in the administrative roles. And again, this reduces the sort of heartburn between these different ethnic groups within Cordoba. With that said, he is not a soft man by any stretch of the imagination. One example of this is eventually he kills the rebel leader. His name is Ibn Hafsun. And once Abdul al-Rahman III defeats Ibn Hafsun's sons, he eventually recovers their father's body that had been buried. He digs it up, brings it to Cordoba, and then crucifies it at the main sort of front gate as you enter into Cordoba, as a warning to obviously future rebels. And this sort of brutality and violence is something that is very present throughout his entire reign. Now, despite allowing all these different groups to operate and work within the sort of government administration with Abd al-Rahman III's rulership, if you will, O'Callaghan admits their meaning. He's talking about the Muwalladun, the Christians who became Muslims. And he says, quote, their assimilation into Muslim society was indeed superficial, and most of them over the course of decades did not convert. But indeed, their motives were probably more material than spiritual. Regardless, his willingness to open up opportunities to the non-Arab population facilitated stability and peace within Cordoba. And this is the lesson that is just completely lost on the Arab aristocracy. So after Abd al-Rahman III passes, this sort of practice goes away. And in particular, the sort of Maliki religious leadership does not like all of this integration because it means a potential weakness or threat to not only Islam, but their version, their jurisprudence, their legal authority of Islamic teachings. Stanley Poole, in his book, The Moors of Spain, describes Abd al-Rahman III's rule and his successes this way. He says, quote, in the annals of Muslims, no prince is more conspicuous for his magnificent rule, his just government, and the brilliance of his court than Abd al-Rahman III. Paradoxically, though, all of these decisions to integrate non-Arabs into government, into society, allowing them to operate in ways or work in ways or trade, and just coalesce, this was not a moral decision. Abd al-Rahman, there was no evidence, was doing this because he felt some sort of religious or, like I said, moral duty or responsibility to these people. He certainly did not see them as equals. It simply was a practical political move, and the right move, by the by. Also, according to all of our available evidence, Abd al-Rahman III, despite what historians love to ignore, was a complete and absolute sociopath. And both these two things can be true at once, right? You can be a complete psycho morally, and also you can be politically and militarily very savvy, right? I think we have this idea that sociopaths can't or live in basements, and the plumbing is broken or something, but that is just not the case. Abd al-Rahman III is indeed a great example of this, as I'm going to go through in a second here. Complete sociopath, and also was a effective and brilliant leader. Now, while historians shed crocodile tears, I would say, over the Spanish Inquisition, they completely whistle past the graveyard when it comes to the Islamic Inquisition. And there were more than one, by the way. And one of them was under the auspices of Abd al-Rahman III. And this is how part of the way he was able to bring security to Cordoba was he has a spy network who looks into and discovers anyone who is in dissent of his authority or his rulership, if you will. And it could have been Christians, it could have been Muwalladun, it could have been Mozarabs, it could have been other Muslims. And he rooted them out, and he would execute them, typically by beheading or crucifixion. Also, he completed a ton of building projects. To this day, it no longer stands, but he built this magnificent architectural masterpiece known as the Palace of Cordoba. Also, I believe he extended the mosque, the Cordoban Mosque. He did a bunch of other things, massive building projects throughout the Caliphate that he started. But all of this came on the backs of the taxing of the dhimmis, the Christians, the Jews, second-class citizens, and also all of the war booty that he accumulated fighting against his enemies, both Christian and non-Christian. I would just say that all of these things, in terms of when we talk about ancient or medieval leaders who build exotic or incredible places or structures or bring about stability and peace within their societies, nothing is really unique here. Like, we have a lot of Roman leaders that did similar things. We have Egyptian leaders that did similar things. Obviously, burdensome taxation, particularly on the non-citizenry, simultaneously going to war to extract treasure and booty to pay for whatever it is you want to pay for. I mean, warfare at this time was certainly an industry, as we will get into, by the way, in the next episode of the Reconquest. The point that I'm really trying to make here is that historians completely ignore the fact that he was indeed a brutal leader, and a lot of the things that he did we would see today as immoral. But again, I don't really care how we view it today. I care about, was this mainstream? And if it wasn't mainstream, was there anything that essentially suggested that he was more brutal than his contemporaries? And certainly that is the case. And again, historians just do not want to talk about it. Morera summarizes it this way, quote, Abd al-Rahman III's political successes were inseparable from and dependent on his inquisitional network of spies and his large-scale beheadings and crucifixion of Muslim heretics, Christian prisoners, and political enemies. As a Spanish scholar put it, quote, the enhanced beheading activity under Abd al-Rahman III was notorious. Moreover, his cultural achievement rested on the wealth collected through the various taxes, including the jizya imposed on the Christian and Jewish dhimmis, and on the loot he obtained in his periodic incursions into the Christian kingdoms. One of the other sort of major cultural achievements, if you want to call it that he did, was he really crystallized the Islamic Maliki teachings, and anybody who would divert away from that sort of version of Islam, he would kill them. Maliki jurisprudence was indeed one of the harshest forms of governance in the Islamic world. Morera highlights his brutal regime as he describes the use of human body parts to decorate Cordoba. It says, quote, this gate of al-Suda, or the gate of the threshold, was one of the arched entrances to Abd al-Rahman III's renowned palace of Medinat al-Zahara. Modern admiring scholarly accounts of this palace omit the fact that on this ornamented gate, the, quote, servant of the merciful, meaning Abd al-Rahman III, routinely exposed to the elements and to the awed Cordoban populace the crucified bodies and severed heads of his enemies. In suppressing dissent, Abd al-Rahman III persecuted any Muslims who followed a legal school other than Maliki, so the Malikianism could remain dominant. This may have been the reason why Abd al-Rahman III's murder of his own son, Abd Allah, who had shown preference to Shafi'ism. So here we have a guy who was so dedicated. It's to me, it's just bewildering. On one hand, he's opening up society to all these different groups of people who aren't even Muslims, but simultaneously, I guess when it comes to the Arab Muslim population, or just the Muslim population generally within Cordoba and Al-Andalus, if they did not follow this specific treaties or jurisprudence, that he would summarily kill them, up to and including his own son, which is insane. Another contemporary Islamic chronicler named Ibn Hayyan praises Abd al-Rahman III and his, not only his inquisition, but the violence he used against his enemies, both external and internal. And he said, and this is a bit of a long one, so bear with me. He wrote, quote, religion after the Prophet continued firm and straight under the aegis of the perfect caliphs who kept the norms of the Sunnah, safeguarding the religion, putting out the fires of sedition, destroying the schismatic sects, expelling the Rafidis, those who reject the right path of Islam, such as the Shiites, humbling the rebels and making them submit, struggling, doing jihad, and defending God with the sword of God. The good caliphs fought all innovators, i.e. Maliki's dictum, no innovation must be accepted. And they did not allow innovation to enter the nation. But then came the rule of the twisted and the deviationists faction of the Abbasids. The innovations proliferated. So essentially he's suggesting that you're not supposed to have innovations. What I can only imagine so much is like twisting of the Islamic or Quranic narrative or the hadiths. And he suggests the Abbasids, who were the usurping group in Damascus, they were doing just that. They were innovating. But God protected the people of Al-Andalus, preserving their religion from calamities thanks to the prince of the believers, Abd al-Rahman III, whom God wanted as caliph, who followed in the steps of his ancestors, adhering closely to scripture and proclaiming the Sunnah, so that no devilish heresy would arise, that he would not destroy, no flag of perdition was raised that he did not humble, so that with him, God kept the community of Islam together, obedient, peaceful. With him, science flourished, people prospered. He expelled innovation and gathered in his capital of Cordoba the most perfect culture of the times as never before existed. And he attended to matters of religion, investigating the behaviors of the Muslims. Authorities had the duty to keep an eye on people's customs and their gatherings in their mosques by means of spies, whom he ordered to penetrate the most intimate secrets of the people so that he could know every action, every thought of good and bad people, and the explicit and hidden views of the different groups of the population. God showered gifts upon him because of his keeping of the law and his subjugating of men. So they sang his praise and his defense of the people's hearts against heresy, following the true and witnessed traditions attributed to the greatest of all imams, Malik ibn Anas, imam of the people of Medina. These traditions are the ones that have benefited this country and purified the people from those tendencies which Abd al-Rahman III punished in those who held them, and he ordered his Zal Medina, Muslim judge in charge of patrolling the public spaces to enforce Sharia, Abdallah B. Badar, his Muwalla, to interrogate the accused and carry out an inquisition against them, terrifying them and punishing them severely. So again, he may have done, a whole host of wonderful things and brought about peace and wealth and commerce within the world, but he did so certainly with an iron fist, not so dissimilar from utilizing, police networks like the Gestapo. Another example of this is in 939, he led his last jihad against the Christians in Castile and Leon. He was defeated, or his armies were defeated. And in the aftermath, he ended up crucifying 10 of his principal officers. The same individual that I just read from, the contemporary Ibn Hayyan, wrote, quote, Abd al-Rahman III ordered the Zala Medina to arrest 10 of the principal officers of the army, the first ones to break rank the day of the Al-Hangadega, who were there in the ranks, whom he named and ordered to be placed on the crosses, which was done by the executioners right away, leaving them crucified. Among their supplications for mercy and pardon, which only increased his anger and insults, while letting them know that they had let him down. He also simultaneously, due to this loss, ended up crucifying another 300 of his officers as traitors of the faith. And ironically, despite that he's like pushing all this sort of aggressive Maliki Islamic jurisprudence on his people, he is not a very good Muslim. He loved to drink. He was a drunkard, supposedly. He was a sexual deviant as well. He sexually abused his concubines. And I don't just mean like force them to have sexual intercourse with him, but he also, when they wouldn't do what he wanted to do, he would get absolutely tanked and then torture and typically kill them. There was an individual named Pleo who was one of his male sex slaves that denied his advances, and so he had Pleo tortured and then beheaded. And this is a pattern. It's not the first time it happens. Likewise, there was a female slave that refused him, and he had her face burned off with a candle. I sort of mentioned this previously, but one of the greatest sort of splendors of the Islamic world in this period was the Caliph's palace. And although it was indeed magnificent, there's no denying that. Frankly, it's more akin to like a medieval P. Diddy sex compound, if you will. Within the palace, he had 300 baths, 400 horses, which, by the way, one horse at this time or any moment in history prior to like the 19th century it's effectively like you own a Lamborghini or a Rolls Royce. And he had 400 horses, 15,000 eunuchs and servants, and a harem of 6,300 women. This palace is celebrated as this is sort of like this eighth wonder of the world by historians today, and they lament the fact that it no longer exists. But the fact is, the things that happened within this palace were absolutely horrific, and no historian or person that supports Abd al-Rahman III and celebrates his successes would ever want to be part of his staff existing within his palace, for sure. The other thing I want to say, we sort of, when we talk about the harem, which is obviously this like army of women that are sex slaves, it's fetishized and we make it sound exotic, sort of oriental, if you will. But the fact of the matter is, these were all women who did not voluntarily sign up to be part of this sex slave ring that was only observant to the Caliph. I mean, it's grotesque, it's disgusting, obviously, in particular to today's moral standards. But again, I sort of go back, was this unique of the time? So far as I'm aware, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Roman emperors, European kings, they may have had paramours, for sure. Many of them would have had some sort of sex slaves, particularly in the Roman period and potentially in the Greek period. But did leaders have, like I said, thousands and thousands of women to fill the ranks that they could just use and abuse as they please? No. So this was, so far as I'm aware, very unique, at least to Islam within the Mediterranean world during this period. The palace was also clearly a flagship for his vicious rulership, as well as the decadence and extravagance of his position of power, both of which would lull him and his successors into a state of affluenza. Al-Hakam II took the reins of the caliphate after his father's death. It sort of continued along the same lines of what Abd al-Rahman III was doing during his reign. He passed, and then his son Hisham II, who was still a child, took over the throne. And this is where things begin to sort of, they actually don't go downhill yet, but things begin to fall apart rather quickly. In order to sort of oversee the realm, if you will, while this individual was still a child, they appointed a prime minister named Muhammad ibn Abu Amir, who was more well-known throughout history and at the time of Al-Mansur, or the Christians would call him Al-Mansur, which just means the victorious. And he ended up taking over and was the de facto ruler in all but name. Like so many of his predecessors, Al-Mansur completely did not trust the Arab aristocracy for probably legitimate reasons. And therefore he completely sort of, how should we say, mixed up or shifted the entire army of the caliphate in order to shield him from potential political and military threats. But then also he created a very, very effective fighting force, which he would go on campaign against the Christians with. So he disbands the Muslim army, and he quickly raises a professional mercenary force predominantly made up of North African Berbers, as well as Christian mercenaries. And one of the major shifts is this now becomes a cavalry heavy, horse heavy unit or fighting force. And one of the major issues is it's all good for Al-Mansur during his reign that he has this very loyal force that is more than happy to work with him. The problem, though, is they are loyal to him. They are not loyal to the caliph writ large and or the caliphate within Al-Andalus. And so once he passes, which he inevitably will, that Berber army, like it's happened so many times, as I mentioned throughout this episode and the last one, becomes a serious threat and nuisance to the leadership in Cordoba. One of the main reasons they're so loyal to Al-Mansur is because during campaigns, this new mercenary force would just reap massive booty and wealth and reward while on campaign. One Islamic contemporary noted, quote, "He made many conquests and seized fortresses which had resisted all those who had preceded him. He filled Al-Andalus with booty and captives, with the sons and daughters of the Christians and their wives." One of the things he did, instead of the Arabs having to fight in his fighting force, he would just have them make fiscal or financial contributions, which in accordance with the sort of Islamic law or jurisprudence, that was still seen as them playing their part as in jihad, if you will. And again, I just want to sort of touch on this and move on. We see this pattern over and over again. Leadership, a whole variety of leaders, whether it's the caliph or an emir or Al-Mansur, that pivots away from the already existing army and raises his own mercenary force. I've talked about it in this episode plenty. And again, this is one feature or practice, if you will, that will eventually undermine the caliphate writ large and is part of the reason, there are many reasons, not just one reason why it doesn't last very long, but this is certainly one of the reasons why the caliphate in Al-Andalus fails and is short-lived. One of the things he did, like so many of his predecessors, is he continued even more building projects in Cordoba. In order to facilitate that, he destroyed many churches, partially because they needed the materials to build their mosques, and or they just converted churches into mosques. Al-Makari, an Islamic chronicler, noted that Al-Mansur used Christian slaves to conduct the renovations and, quote, "other infidel countries working in chains at the building instead of the Muslims, thus exalting the true religion and trampling down of the polytheists." One of the most notable sort of moments within Spanish medieval history is he has Christian slaves carry away the great bells of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Cordoba, to Cordoba, where they melted them down and then turned them into lamps within the Cordoban mosque. According to contemporary, in contrast to what historians say about the glory and religious tolerance of Al-Andalus and Cordoba in this era, Al-Mansur, quote, carried out virulent persecutions and book burnings against the theological deviations in the Greek philosophy that might contribute to them. According to Sayyid al-Andalusi in the early 10th century, quote, whoever had studied those sciences, meaning philosophies, became regarded as prone to heterodoxy and suspected of heresy. Most of those until then had studied philosophy, now lost their interests in it, became terrified and kept secret the fact that they knew the subject. The more talented men of the times, until the collapse of the Umayyad Dynasty in Spain, cultivated only those sciences which were allowed to be studied, such as arithmetic, medicine, and similar disciplines. So just to re-emphasize what I'm trying to say here, again, many historians argued that Cordoba, the caliphate in Al-Andalus, was tolerant. They were open to ideas, to different religions, to different peoples, ethnic groups. However, again, this was not the rule. This was the exception. The rule, typically speaking, was absolute intolerance. And like I said, I believe in the introduction, depending on who the ruler was at that time, they would implement very harsh and aggressive policing of ideas or individuals that did not fall in line with sort of the traditional Maliki teachings of Islam. With all of that said, much like his predecessor, Abd al-Rahman III, he kept his armies very happy, and the Christian mercenaries were actually allowed to practice their religious beliefs, particularly while they were on campaign. Simultaneously at home, he sort of continued the promulgation or allowing non-Muslims and new converts, the Muwalladun, to play a part in the administrative functions within the caliphate, which again kept things all hunky-dory at home while he could go on campaign again and again and again. And throughout his lifetime, he did some, I believe it was 52, he had 52 successful military expeditions against the Christians. And among the Christians, he was greatly feared. This is, again, one of those, like I said before, it kind of goes up and down. This is one of those moments, again, where Islam is just rocking and rolling within the Iberian Peninsula, and the Christians in the north are doing everything they can just to hang on to the reconquered areas that they've taken over by this point. To this end, the just utter devastation by the Christians was noted by chroniclers at the time and reported when Al-Mansur finally died. Christian chroniclers wrote, quote, at that time in Spain, divine worship perished. All the glory of the Christian people was destroyed. The treasures stored up in the churches was plundered. But at last, after enduring such great ruin, the divine mercy denied to lift this yoke from their necks of the Christians. After many horrible massacres of Christians, Al-Mansur was seized in the great city of Merdin Aseli by the demon which had possessed him. While he was alive, he was buried in hell. By the late 10th century, Al-Mansur had effectively completely taken over. I mean, he would not go as far as to say that he was the caliph, because that would be heresy and cause all kinds of chaos within the caliphate. But he was effectively the caliph at this time. Hisham II had come of age and just was not interested at all in ruling. He's, again, one of these great grandchildren that just could have cared less about any sort of duty or obligation or responsibility to his kingdom. After Al-Mansur died, Hisham II had become so accustomed to capitulating that Al-Mansur's son took over. And although Hisham II, again, was at that age where he could take over at this point because he was no longer a child, he just stepped aside and allowed Al-Mansur's son to take over and abandon his role as caliph, even though, again, he was still technically the caliph. And all of this would eventually sort of start the snowballing effect that would bring about the end of the caliphate. As soon as Al-Mansur's son dies, massive civil war ensues. The mercenary armies no longer have a figurehead to follow, and so they do whatever is in their best interest to not only maintain whatever power they had, but also they want to remain prominent. They want to be respected, and they do not want to be pushed aside by the Arab aristocracy. Simultaneously, the Arab elites, who were sort of pushed aside and ignored largely by Al-Mansur and his son. They are infuriated in terms of just what's happened in recent history, that they are no longer important. They feel as though there's too much integration, there's too much tolerance. And for all of these reasons, there is just upheaval, civil war. Many of the caliphs that come to power are not there very long. It's very reminiscent of sort of the early days during the conquest, the initial conquest, where you had those governors. They're toppled over rather quickly. No one really remains in power very long until finally, or eventually in 1031, the caliphate is basically dissolved. Angus Mackey, in his book Spain in the Middle Ages, notes, quote, after the death of Al-Mansur's son, Abd al-Malik, in 1008, the caliphate disintegrated, and by 1031, it had been replaced by Taifa states whose rulers were absolutely incapable of presenting a united front against the Christians. I'm going to sort of read this final piece here just so I can cruise through to the end. The success and failures of the caliphate in Al-Andalus were largely due to whether or not the ruler in Córdoba was willing to accommodate non-Arab Muslims and the non-Muslims generally. The lack of trust among the Islamic elites also played a significant role in the collapse of the caliphate. New rulers would recruit mercenary armies, both Muslim and Christian, that were loyal to them. But when they died, these new mercenary armies, and their leaders would revolt due to the new leadership's inability to maintain the status quo. That is, the sort of brief, tolerant integration of ethnic groups and other religions into the governing body, the administration, and just society writ large. So despite what scholars and historians say about the tolerance and equitable treatment of others in the Andalusian Caliphate, it was actually their consistent and routine intolerance and ill treatment of the natives and non-Arabs that triggered the catastrophic meltdown of their hegemony. Moreover, as they ratcheted up the pressure internally, they essentially handed Christian fortunes a new host of supporters and followers that empowered Christian kingdoms to the north. And again, one of the biggest pieces of evidence we have of just the lack of equality, so to speak, which again, it's what historians suggest is happening at this time, is the fact that over the course of hundreds of years or decades even, you see Christians and non-Christians fleeing either to the north, or in some cases, they actually flee to other locations like Crete to set up new kingdoms. Sort of my main point that I'm trying to make here is that people vote with their feet. Most Arabs, Christians, and even Muslims sought assistance from the Christians in the north to either defeat or thwart Islamic armies, caliphs, emirs, or governors in the south since legitimately day one. If indeed all the things that scholars say about Andalusia were true, there would be no need, motivation, or vigor for the Spanish reconquest. So again, what I'm simply trying to say is, if the caliphate, if Cordoba was indeed this not just multicultural, but the integration of all these various different groups, there would be no fuel to the fire of the Christians in the north. The reconquest certainly played a part in the sort of fracturing and creating schisms within the caliphate. However, the rise and fall, the quick fall of the caliphate in the south, the Umayyad Caliphate in Andalusia, fell because they could just not administer their government in an effective way, particularly over the course of multiple generations. After the fall of the caliphate, the remaining Islamic people, they just fractured into kingdoms known as, like I said, the Taifa kingdoms. And then the decades to come, the Christian kingdoms throughout the peninsula would create wedges between these Taifas and deteriorate their power. And in the early 11th century, the Christians put the pedal to the floor, and the reconquest was really in full swing. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you for sticking with it. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. In the next episode and moving forward, we're basically going to focus all of our energy on sort of the north now and the reconquest and the knights and what they did to reclaim their historical Visigothic, Roman, Spanish territory. I'm Zach Masick. We'll see you next time. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Deuces.